When I'm driving around Mississauga, there are always two things I notice. One, there's a lot of traffic on these roads. And two, most of them are really straight. Hurontario, Cawthra, Burnhamthorpe, Eglinton, Lakeshore, Dundas. All of them straight lines, heading east-west or north-south. That's the work of John Graves Simcoe, military leader and first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. Simcoe was a big believer in the British way of doing things, and in the early 1800s, the British military preferred their roads to be as straight as the rulers they used to draw lines on their maps. Welcome to We Built This City, Episode 1, The Mississaugas of the Credit. As any math teacher will tell you, straight lines are the most efficient way to travel. A fact militaries have known since the Roman Empire. So, when British surveyors arrived in the area in the early 1800s, they drew lot lines according to Simcoe's specifications for all these new roads. All of them, except for one, Mississauga Road. Starting on the shores of Lake Ontario, Mississauga Road follows a more natural trajectory along the west side of the Credit River, which also happens to be the higher side of the riverbank. Why is that? Why is Mississauga Road different? Because unlike all the other major thoroughfares that crisscross this city, Mississauga Road has a much older story to tell about the land and the people who have lived here continuously for over 10,000 years. The Credit River flows through the heart of Mississauga, both in terms of its geography and its history. Starting at its headwaters above the Niagara Escarpment near Orangeville and Caledon East, it drains an area of approximately 1,000 square kilometers to empty into Lake Ontario in Port Credit. Even today, as the city of Mississauga has grown up around it, most of the Credit River can still be traveled by canoe or kayak. And the lower section that flows through the city provides spawning areas for Chinook salmon and rainbow trout. Look closely, and you'll see a fish ladder on the river in Streetsville. The Credit River. Its English name comes from the time when French fur traders supplied goods to the native people in advance, on credit, against furs that would be delivered the following spring. It was known as the Rivière au Crédit. The trading post was set up at the mouth of the river, in Port Credit, in the early 18th century. The Mississaugas would travel down from their farms and homes to trade with the Europeans along the centuries-old path that today bears their name, Mississauga Road. To understand the origins of the word Mississauga, we need to travel about 600 kilometers north from Port Credit on the shores of Lake Ontario to Blind River on the north shore of another of the Great Lakes, Lake Huron. This is the mouth of the Mississauga River and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, part of the Ojibwa Nation. The term Umisage, or Mississauga, was first recorded in 1640 by the Jesuits as the name of the Anishinaabe people living in this large region. It's also possible that the word Mississauga comes from the Ojibwa word Mississauki, which means river of many mouths. Whatever its origins, by the early 18th century, the French referred to all Anishinaabe people who lived between Lakes Ontario, Erie, and Huron, and those on the north shore of Lake Huron, as Mississaugas. At this point in history, the Mississaugas controlled much of modern-day southern Ontario, land they claimed through wartime conquest. In the mid-1600s, Indigenous nations were at war. The Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, had just defeated the Wendat, also known as the Huron, and began pushing into the territory of the Algonquins, including the territory of the Mississaugas on the north shore of Lake Huron. The Mississaugas and their French allies pushed back, driving the Haudenosaunee to the south shore of Lake Ontario. Following the negotiation of a peace treaty with the Mohawk Nation, the Mississaugas settled in two groups, one along the Trent River near present-day Brockville, and the other in the area of what we now call the Golden Horseshoe, between the Rouge River, which today forms Toronto's eastern border, and the Niagara River, which connects Lake Ontario with Lake Erie. During this period, the Mississaugas lived in small family groups, moving with the seasons between four main rivers: the Cheesippi, the Rouge River, the Kobakanock, or Humber River, the Adupacog, Etobicoke Creek, and the Michini, Credit River, where they would fish during the spring and fall salmon runs, and in summer gather wild rice and harvest corn on the river flats. Then they'd follow their well-traveled route north to spend the winter inland, away from the bitter cold of Lake Ontario. In the 1720s, the French established fur trade posts along Lake Ontario, offering credit to the Mississaugas. The Michinihe became known as the Credit River to the French, and the people living there became the Mississaugas of the Credit. And so life continued, until that fateful battle, far, far away, on the plains of Abraham. On September 13th, 1759, British General James Wolfe defeated French leader the Marquis de Montcalm, leading to the surrender of Quebec to the British. A year later, the French lost control of the territory and in 1763 surrendered Canada to the British. As part of that power shift, a royal proclamation was issued that stated only the Crown, not individual settlers, could acquire Indian lands. At first, not much changed for the Mississaugas. But then, the shot heard round the world, the American Revolution, brought British negotiators to the Mississaugas territory. Thousands of British sympathizers were on the move, refugees from the American Revolution. The British Crown began purchasing large tracts of land for the incoming United Empire Loyalists, and between 1781 and 1820, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation concluded 8 treaties with the Crown. Initially, the Mississaugas believed these agreements were mutually beneficial, strengthening their relationship with a powerful ally. Why? Because the Mississaugas and the British had drastically different concepts about land. The Mississaugas saw land as a shared community resource. The British viewed it through the lens of absolute ownership. So, when the Mississaugas signed those treaties, they thought that the British were going to establish a few settlements along Lake Ontario. However, by 1791, 20,000 settlers had arrived in Upper Canada, and the relationship with the Mississaugas was an uneasy one. To begin with, the new settlers brought diseases, smallpox, tuberculosis, and measles, which killed almost 1/2 of the Mississaugas between the 1790s and 1820s. Then there was the murder of Chief Wabakanine and his wife in the summer of 1796. It was August, and Chief Wabakanine and a small group, including his wife and sister, had traveled to York to sell salmon. They decided to camp near the present-day St. Lawrence Market at the foot of Jarvis Street. That night, Private Charles McEwen of the Queen's York Rangers and 2 friends came to the camp and attempted to assault Chief Wabakanine's sister. The chief intervened, and McEwen hit back, beating Chief Wabakanine with a rock, while the 2 other men beat Chief Wabakanine's wife. Both died of their injuries. Although Private McEwen was detained, he was never convicted. The murder of such a respected leader shocked the First Nations. Naturally, the Mississaugas were enraged. Chief Wabakanine was their head chief, and he was a signatory to many of the early treaties. The tension between the Mississaugas and the settlers had reached a peak. As the colonial government scrambled to respond appropriately, the Mississaugas considered an armed uprising against the tiny British military force present in the colony. The chief's murder ultimately changed the once trusting relationship between the Mississaugas and the Crown, affecting how the First Nations negotiated land surrenders from that moment forward. In 1805, the Crown wanted the Mississaugas to surrender the entire Mississauga tract. In previous treaties, the Mississaugas had allowed the Crown to establish the land boundaries of a treaty, but this time the Mississaugas refused, knowing the Crown had no intention of sharing the land as the Mississaugas intended. On August 2, 1805, Mississaugas and the British Crown signed Provisional Agreement 13A, and ratified it in Treaty 14 the following year. In it, the British acquired a strip of land from Etobicoke Creek west to Burlington Bay and north 6 miles to modern-day Eglinton Avenue. The British divided it into 2 areas, Halton Township and Toronto Township, the latter of which became the city of Mississauga. In return, the Mississaugas were to receive £1,000 in trade goods and the sole right of fisheries at 12 and 16-mile creeks, along with the possession of each creek's flats. In addition, the Mississaugas also reserved the sole right of fishing at the Credit River and were to retain a 1-mile strip of land on each of its banks and the interior of the Mississauga Tract, north of Eglinton Avenue. In 1818, the British acquired the rest of the Mississauga Tract, which consisted of 648,000 acres north of Eglinton Avenue. For this land, the Mississaugas received a yearly sum of £522 and 10 shillings in goods. In 1820, the Crown negotiated for the reserve lands that the Mississaugas had retained in 1806, including most of the land at the Credit River and the land at 12 and 16-mile creeks. These lands were to be held in trust, with proceeds from the sales and leases of the land going to the Mississaugas for maintenance and religious instruction. The Mississaugas also retained 200 acres on the east side of the Credit River, which was supposed to be for a village. The 200 acres were never included in a treaty and were subject to a land claim in the 1980s, for which the Mississaugas received just under $13 million. Treaty 23 was signed later the same day and surrendered land on either side of Dundas Street. In return, the Mississaugas received £50 of provisions. As these treaties were being negotiated, colonial surveyors were moving in, laying out the roads and lot lines for the expected settlers. One of them was Augustus Jones. Born and raised in New York, where he trained as a surveyor, Jones and his family were among the British Loyalists who arrived in York after the American Revolution. Augustus surveyed much of the land along the lakeshore from York to the Trent River, eventually becoming Deputy Surveyor General. After retiring from the post in 1800, he became a magistrate, military captain, and eventually a wealthy farmer near Paris, Ontario, where he lived with his wife, Takarahogan, daughter of the Mohawk chief, and their 8 children. But that wasn't his only family. With Tubenenekwe, daughter of the Mississaugas chief, he had 2 sons. The eldest, Thayeneneke, also known as John, and the younger son, Kekuakwanabe, also known as Sacred Feathers. His English name was Peter. Both boys were raised among their mother's people until 1816. That's when they went to live with their father, learning about farming and attending school. By the early 1800s, the Mississaugas population had declined, and they were divided among many tiny encampments along the rivers and creeks that flowed into Lake Ontario. Both game and fish populations were depleted, and as a result, Mississaugas began to make baskets, brooms, wooden bowls, and ladles, to sell to the settlers to support themselves. In 1823, Peter Jones converted to the Methodist religion and returned to the Credit River in 1824. He told them about his acceptance of Christianity and encouraged the Mississaugas to travel with him to Davisville, on the shores of the Grand River, where Chief Thomas Davis had established a Mohawk Christian settlement with scripture readings and morning prayers offered in the Mohawk language. Peter's mother, Tubeniniquay, was one of the first Mississauga converts at Davisville. It is estimated that about 150 of the 200 Mississaugas of the Credit converted to Christianity at Davisville. Afterwards, Peter Jones and the converted Mississaugas traveled to the council fire at the Humber River, where they were to receive their annual presents. Here, Reverend John Strawn saw Peter Jones's influence on the Mississaugas and suggested they settle permanently at the Credit River. Strawn told them the government would now fulfill its treaty agreement to build them a village. By the fall of 1826, the Mississaugas moved into their 20 new homes at the Credit River, with another 20 houses to follow. The village, known as the Credit Mission, was located on Mississauga Road, where the Mississauga Golf and Country Club is today. The Credit Reserve totaled 3,500 acres. It included all the land in the southern portion of the mile on either side of the Credit River from the modern-day Queensway to Lake Ontario. According to Peter Jones, every family at the Credit Mission received half an acre to garden and 50 acres to farm. Peter Jones's biracial background made him uniquely suited to help the Mississaugas not only in their communication with the government, but in the transition between their traditional ways and Christian and farming lifestyle. Between 1826 and 1847, the Credit Mission village thrived. The Mississaugas cleared 900 acres of land for crops and pasture. They were not content to raise only fields of corn, beans, and squash, which were typical crops of the past, instead raising fields of oat, wheat, peas, and vegetables. Community members even planted small orchards and raised beef, pork, and fowl. The Credit Mission grew to include a school, a Methodist church, 2 sawmills, a blacksmith, a meeting lodge, and a hospital. The Mississaugas were 2/3 shareholders in the Credit Harbor Company, constructing the port at the mouth of the Credit River. They also owned and operated a schooner, the Credit Chief, in the harbor. In 1829, Peter Jones was elected chief, and in 1833, Jones became the first ordained Indigenous Methodist minister in Upper Canada. In his final years, Peter Jones wrote The History of the Ojibwe Indians, which provides an eyewitness account of the culture of the Ojibwe people. Despite the success of the Credit Mission, the Mississaugas had decided to leave the Credit River as early as 1840. There were several reasons for this, including settler encroachment, depletion of natural resources, and not being able to secure title to the land they were living on. The community had spent much of the 1830s trying to secure title, including Peter Jones traveling to England to meet with Queen Victoria in 1838. Many locations had been explored, but they were not suitable for farming. The government was preparing to sell the lands around the Credit River. The survey was complete and an auction scheduled. The Mississaugas needed to find a new home. The Six Nations, after hearing about the Mississaugas' predicament, offered them land on their reserve on the Grand River. On April 7, 1847, the Mississaugas accepted the Six Nations' offer. The Mississaugas acquired 6,000 acres in their traditional territory, and in May 1847, about 250 people left the Credit River for the Grand River and established a new reserve near Hagersville, Ontario. In 1903, the Mississaugas of the Credit purchased the land from the Six Nations. Today, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation is a community composed of approximately 2,700 members. 1/3 of the community lives on reserve lands, while the rest mostly live in the greater Golden Horseshoe area. An active community, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation strives to share its history and culture with everyone. The First Nation hosts an annual historical gathering and Three Fires homecoming powwow and traditional gathering that welcome hundreds of visitors to its reserve. As active stewards of their treaty lands and territory, the Mississaugas of the Credit promote the wise use of lands, waters, and resources so that the next 7 generations, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, might enjoy the land we share. In 2019, the city of Mississauga inducted former Chief Carolyn King into Mississauga's Legends Row, recognizing her lifelong commitment to develop a better understanding of Indigenous people. In the early 2000s, Carolyn created the Moccasin Identifier Project. Working with Indigenous artist Philip Cote, 4 moccasin designed stencils representing the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Cree were created. Since 2021, the Moccasin Identifier Project has installed these stenciled images at culturally significant sites across the GTA, including along Lakeshore Road in Mississauga and the entrance to the Credit Valley Conservation Offices, to help promote the region's diverse Indigenous cultures and the strong ties Indigenous communities have to the land. To date, the project has visited over 1,000 schools, universities, workshops, major events, opening ceremonies, and celebrations. The vision is to cover Canada in moccasins, so no matter where we travel, be it along straight roads or those that curve along the river's edge, we may all be reminded of those who have walked the land for thousands of years and gave this city its name. It took a lot of people and stories to build Mississauga into what it is today, Canada's 6th largest city. Come visit us across our social platforms and on our website at visitmississauga.com.